This is going to be an introduction video to a number of video series that I plan on making. And it's going to give an overview of how I see the development cycle of an application from idea to implementation to getting rid of it. Using my past experience, I've come up with this basic overview of how I see application development. And whether you're working on something very small that is going to be used briefly, or whether it's a very large project that you're a member of a team that has to get it working or not, I think these steps generally tend to be a common denominator for everything. I want to keep this video generic, and I want to use it as an introduction to a series of videos for multiple projects that I have in mind to show you how the process works. I found over the years that there are different ways to get a computer to do something, but ultimately how you get it to do what you want it to do has their own challenges. The order in which you do things can change, or some of these steps can even be skipped, and it will have an impact on the outcome of that project. You can go online and you can see how different people have come up with different ways to implement something, or how they have defined the various life cycles and the various stages of a given project. And in this video, I just want to step back a little bit more, and I want to show a slightly larger picture. If you do decide to implement what I've outlined here, you may find that your mileage will vary. What usually kicks off any application or computer program generally starts with an idea. They say necessity is the mother of invention, and you will find that is usually the case. Whether you want to do something out of curiosity, oh, can I get the computer to do this? Oh, what if I do this? That would be a motivation to do something. It could be a challenge. I want to learn how to program in this language, or I want to see if I can slap a computer around. Sometimes you might have an existing process, but you'll want to find a faster and more efficient way of doing it. And a good way of that is the natural evolution of the way we use word processors or Office suites nowadays. We used to have typewriters, and typewriters were very good back in the day, but nobody liked making mistakes, so they've invented a way of correcting it before they put ink on paper, and then that ultimately became a word processor. So in this case, there is a need to find a more efficient and easier way to do something. And then, of course, there's greed. I want to make money selling a game, or I want to make money selling an app. That doesn't really do anything very useful, but people will buy anyway because it's fill in the blank. The last form of motivation I could think of is that you would end up finding an expectation that having such a tool would be invaluable. In essence, you've come up with an idea and you're confident that you want something, but you don't really know exactly what it is just yet. This step could happen in a moment, or it could stretch out for days or weeks or even months. So now you figured out you've got an idea to build something, and it's worth the effort to realize that dream. In a lot of cases, I find that people are fairly lazy, and the first thing they'll do is they'll just explore the landscape. Is there something already that exists that can fill that need? Or if there is, but it doesn't quite fit, can I customize it to fit my specific needs? And something else that we tend to do is we just look around at how other people have done things to draw our own inspiration from them and to see how they might have resolved similar problems. And at this point, I find that this is where people tend to start veering off into different directions. Depending on the success of whatever it is you're trying to do, or depending on the complexity, it's a very good idea to ask yourself if reinventing the wheel is necessary. On a fair number of occasions at work, I would find that I needed to write a really quick script to grab the output of something, parse it out, and to create some kind of structured data that would feed some other process. And usually in that case, because of the nature of the data processing or the data parsing, I find it's just easier to reinvent the wheel over and over again. And I'll end up using, in this case, Perl to read a text file, use the regular expressions that are built into it to tokenize the individual text, put them into different variables, and then output them in some kind of format. And in a case like that, there really isn't much beyond the tokenizing and output part of it. So reinventing that particular wheel is almost a necessity. In other cases, I'll end up taking something that exists already and I'll just modify it slightly. But ultimately, it comes down to I am not rewriting Microsoft Outlook because I find that it's not quite as user-friendly as I would like it to be. The next thing you need to do is you need to get a sense of who's going to end up using it. And by using it, I mean as opposed to who would benefit from its existence. If you're writing a word processor that you want to sell to somebody, your customer might end up being a magazine publisher. So they would be the direct end user of that word processor. However, their customers are only interested in, let's say, a printed paper magazine. They may be the beneficiary of that word processor, but they're not necessarily a direct user of it. Getting a sense of who's going to end up using it will also give you a sense of how much you can expect to get a return on your investment of having to develop this application. At this point, if you're still committed to writing your own application, this is where it's very beneficial to start a very long and protracted phase of creating a list of features, design goals, limitations. What exactly is it that you're going to do? What is it exactly that it will do? What is it that you do not want it to do? What sort of compromises are you willing to make? Are you willing to live with certain features that are in or not in? Or what exactly are you absolutely dead set against putting in? This is the phase of the project where you haven't really decided how you're going to implement it. All you're really interested in, do you need to put in this or can you leave this out? Is this a necessary feature or can it be omitted? If it is a necessary feature, can you phase this feature in at a later time? And how is it going to impact the upgrade or the maintenance cycle? It took me a little while to get to this point, but are you emotionally mature enough to say, no, I will not do this? And something else you have to consider is whose idea is it and what is the pressure to get it done? If you're just one cog in a very large machine, you may have a pointy-haired boss come down and say, I want this done. And they may be pressuring you to get something done that makes absolutely no sense. So there is definitely a place to push back. And this would probably be one of those places. You also want to ask yourself, how do I plan on maintaining it? If it's a temporary tool that you're going to be using for something else, its maintenance is probably not very important and you can afford to cut certain corners. But if it's going to be a project that will end up being very useful for a very long time, you'll also want to think about how you're going to maintain it. There are hidden resources that are needed just to keep something maintained and operational. And if you don't take that into consideration, your project might last for a short bit of time before it no longer becomes feasible, or if you're running a business, just to keep the application or this thing running. And without even having started anything at all, only having put ideas down on paper, at this point, it may be a good idea to develop your exit strategy. When I first learned about computers and I was playing around with it growing up and going to college and learning about it more formally there, I was far less interested in the feasibility of an idea, and I would just blindly run into something headlong without giving any thought. And the ultimate success or failure of it was a bit of a gamble. But if you play this game long enough, you end up developing a sense of what will and will not be a worthwhile endeavor. And learning to say no is a very hard part of it. Even at this point, if it looks like it's going to be a viable project with a beneficial outcome, it's still better at this point to develop an exit strategy in case looking at it through a microscope in more detail would prove to be less beneficial than originally thought, and being prepared to abandon it is a good mental place to be. So now we've had an idea and we've come up with a list of things that we've decided we want done. You've given it careful consideration, and you do not think that there are any alternatives or shortcuts. You essentially need to get it done. This is where the general starts to become the specific. At this point, we need to start working out how we're going to get there. We need to start breaking everything down into individual components and look at those components and ask what is required for that component to be a success. Is it going to be a standalone application? For example, you might decide you want to create the ultimate calculator that people can download and run on their mobile device. In that case, it's a standalone application. Is it an application that is going to run somewhere? Is it something people are just going to point to on their web browser, for example, such as timeanddate.com? If your application idea is to tell people when the sun is going to rise, when it's going to set, you can have a far greater reach, make it a website, and then they can use any web browser they want to get their information. Or is it going to be a hybrid of the two? Are you planning to create an application that is going to talk to some backend server somewhere to save and retrieve data? Is there some backend device somewhere that whatever you're writing has to talk to? And how often is it going to have to communicate with it? And what are the resource requirements going to be needed? What kind of technology do you plan to use? What's the programming language? What are the frameworks that you plan on using? What are the various services it's going to need? Are you going to need a database? Are you going to need a search engine? Do you need to go and pull data from somewhere else? Are you going to have to push data somewhere else? Where do you plan on running this? Is it an application people run on their mobile device? Do you have an in-house server or a data center that you're going to use? Or are you going to use cloud computing? Or in other words, are you going to use somebody else's server? If whatever you're developing is going to require you to expand your own in-house data center just to run this new application, what are the maintenance costs going to be? If you're going to use an external cloud computer, what kind of traffic do you expect? Are you going to be surprised when somebody takes notice of your website and decides to try a distributed denial of service attack, and you're suddenly faced with a 10,000% monthly charge? It's at this point where you want to start looking at how much it's going to cost to develop it and what kind of rewards you expect to get out of it to determine the feasibility of it. And again, at this point, you'll want to ask yourself once again how you plan to maintain it. Is the framework that you're using likely to be supported in a year or in 2 years or in 5 years? What happens if there are bugs in those frameworks that you plan on using? This thing that you're developing, are you choosing a framework that is fairly esoteric, that is required for this project of yours to work? What happens if that fairly specific piece of software that you've got ends up being discontinued? How is that going to affect the overall life cycle of your project? And once again, I would just like to reiterate that it is a good idea to develop an exit strategy. So you've had an idea now, you've looked around and you thought that perhaps there is no other alternative, you want to build it. You've kind of come up with the outline of how you want to build it. The next step, of course, is to build it. I'm not really going to talk in great detail about this particular step. It should be self-explanatory, and there are many, many other resources, but it's very simple. You start coding, you test it, you debug it, you test it, you debug it, you test it, you keep iterating. If and when you are happy with it, then you have somebody else test it, and they will very likely find something quickly that you never thought of, and you'll realize that you haven't completely debugged it. After the grueling coding stage, you now have a product that you are willing to put out there, so you go live with it. And of course, this is where the real fun begins. You enter the maintenance phase. Bugs will invariably be found. People will invariably find ways to break your application, and you need to put out updates. At the same time, if it is a very large project, you may have decided to leave out certain features that were not essential at the beginning that you would like to add in later on. I would just like to point out that in this phase, I find that it's better to wait a little while to let production shake out any bugs that might be found before you start adding the next feature in there. This cycle can end up being quite iterative and can last a very, very long time. Sometimes you might have a mature product that just works, that people are just happy to use, and it can stay running in production without touching it for years. At some point, eventually, all applications, every last one of them, will at some point outlive their usefulness. And it becomes a matter of what do you do and what is required to back off from the whole endeavor. In some cases, you just walk away. You say, that's it. I'm no longer supporting it. I'm no longer maintaining it. I'm no longer developing it. If somebody bought a copy of it, it's up to them to get rid of it. But if it's an application that you've developed that runs on a server somewhere, there's probably a good chance that you've ended up collecting user data. And the question becomes, what do you do with that user data? Part of the application could require somebody to give you their name, their email address, maybe their shipping address, things like that. Do you just simply nuke the database? Nowadays, I'm not surprised if somebody would just end up selling that to somebody else. But dealing with end-of-life resources is very important in some cases. If you're decommissioning something, why are you decommissioning it? Is it just one part of a much larger ecosystem? And are you just replacing that one specific component? Or are you getting rid of the entire thing? If you're in a data center, you might be dealing with a network array storage device, one or more hardware servers that are running virtual machines. Each virtual machine might be running a specific operating system. You may have data that is stored either in the virtual machine or on a common mount point somewhere on that network array storage device. And if you're decommissioning a specific component, it may be that you're upgrading an operating system, but the underlying database remains where it was on the network array storage device. Or maybe you're shutting the entire data center down and you're getting rid of everything. So one of the decommissioning checklist items is, what are you planning to do with those components that happen to be where they are? And then, of course, something else to consider is that if you're doing something that ends up becoming a service that somebody else relies on, it's always nice and best practices to give them a good, reasonable amount of time notice before you decide to turn that service off, to give them a chance to find some alternative. That's basically going to be it for this particular video. I've tried to keep it as generic and as simple as I could without being specific for any one application. But I found that overall and in general terms, these are the various steps that make or break the success of a given project.